Behind every military action lies the work of intelligence. You cannot strike what you cannot locate, and you certainly cannot hope to win a war without understanding your enemy. Japan had virtually no realistic chance of winning World War II to begin with, but the shortcomings and mismanagement of its intelligence system only made matters worse. Still, the intelligence failures of Imperial Japan were more complex than they first appear, and they did not suddenly emerge during the war. The roots of Japanese military intelligence stretch back to the late 19th century. The Imperial Army and Navy each built their own intelligence networks independently, and at first these were far from professional institutions. Early intelligence gathering often meant little more than asking Japanese expatriates in foreign countries to share whatever useful information they happened to know. In 1890, an army officer named Sei Arai founded the Institute for Sino-Japanese Trade, becoming one of the first Japanese organizations specifically aimed at collecting intelligence. This move came as Japan prepared for what would become the First Sino-Japanese War. Although China possessed a much larger army, Japanese intelligence identified key weaknesses and structural problems in the Chinese forces, enabling Japan to achieve a swift and decisive victory. A few years later, Japan's attention shifted toward Russia. By this time, the Imperial Navy had consolidated its foreign intelligence operations under a centralized body known only as the Third Department, while the Army still relied on its informal, outdated methods and resisted major changes even as war with Russia loomed. Nevertheless, these loosely organized networks reached the same conclusion they had reached about China. Japan could not hope to win a long, drawn-out conflict with the Russian Empire, but rapid strikes early in the war might secure victory before Russia's logistical machine could mobilize. This assessment once again proved correct, and Japan's unexpected triumph permanently damaged Imperial Russia. Japanese strategic thinking and intelligence practices followed what is commonly known as the Prussian model, which emphasized winning through swift tactical victories. Unfortunately, Japanese planners dismissed emerging theories of total war that were developing in the early 20th century, a miscalculation that would have dire consequences decades later. After the Russo-Japanese War, the Army began forming a more structured intelligence organization, including the Second Department of the Army General Staff, which focused heavily on code breaking. Contrary to popular belief, Japanese early cryptographic work was remarkably advanced. By the 1920s, Japanese code breakers had fully cracked the diplomatic ciphers and partially cracked the military ciphers of the United States, the United Kingdom, and China. By acquiring Soviet encrypted materials and sending them to Poland, they even managed to read portions of Soviet diplomatic communications. For the Army, the Soviet Union remained the primary signals intelligence target well into World War II. But during the 1930s, Soviet security and cryptographic practices improved rapidly. New encryption systems were introduced constantly, many of which could eventually be broken, but only after significant delays, which reduced their usefulness and accuracy. Because of an intelligence sharing agreement with Germany, Japan often traded decrypted British and American messages in exchange for German decrypts of Soviet communications. These complications were a major factor in Japan's defeat during the Soviet-Japanese border conflict. At Kolchin Gol, Japanese cryptologists managed to break Soviet Air Force codes, but failed to crack the Red Army systems. As a result, they underestimated Soviet troop strength by a factor of 4. Rather than recognizing the overwhelming Soviet presence, Japanese intelligence focused on mapping Soviet positions, wrongly assuming that precise battlefield knowledge would allow them to win quickly. After the conflict, the Soviet Union adopted a far more secure encryption system that Japan did not successfully penetrate until 1944. Japan also faced difficulties with Soviet-supported Chinese communist communications. While Japan easily broke Kuomintang codes, communist guerrilla ciphers, designed with Soviet guidance and changed frequently, proved much more resistant. Japan largely broke these systems by 1941,
but their ability to read intercepted communist communications remained inconsistent. Earlier I mentioned Japan's success in cracking British and American codes. While the Army struggled with Soviet encryption, the Navy performed much better against its own intelligence targets, the US and Britain. The Imperial Navy's code-breaking efforts were impressive, defeating many early American cipher systems at a time when the United States placed relatively little effort into strengthening encryption. The Department of State's Gray Code and Brown Code were both broken soon after their introduction in the 1920s and 1930s. These basic systems were eventually replaced with more advanced strip ciphers, which Japan painstakingly broke after a long and difficult process, a feat neither Britain nor Germany ever accomplished. This gave Japan the ability to read large portions of U.S. diplomatic and military traffic. Japan even positioned a specially converted oiler near Hawaii to intercept American naval transmissions. In 1938, Japan went further, establishing a listening post in Mexico capable of receiving signals from Washington, D.C. and New York City, giving them valuable insight into both Atlantic and Pacific naval operations. However, Japan's success in breaking American codes did not extend to British systems. British diplomatic codes proved extremely difficult, requiring years of effort to penetrate. In 1934, Japan made a major breakthrough when a Japanese typist working in the British consulate in Sapporo literally threw a diplomatic codebook out a window so that Japanese agents could retrieve it. But the British replaced their encryption systems in 1935, rendering the stolen material obsolete. Japan persisted nonetheless, and by around 1940, gained the ability to reliably decrypt British diplomatic messages, information that helped Japan determine early in 1941 that British defenses in Malaya and Singapore were weak. Despite all its efforts, Japan overwhelmingly focused on offensive code-breaking and invested far less in securing its own encryption. The Imperial Navy is believed to have used only two major cipher systems leading up to and during World War II. Both could be broken, at least partially, by U.S. and British cryptologists. The Navy did make small modifications before major operations, which was enough to keep attacks like Pearl Harbor hidden, but ultimately inadequate for long-term security.
The Navy became overly confident in its own operational security and often assumed that its codes were unbreakable. The revised system used after Pearl Harbor was indeed relatively difficult to decipher, but that sense of invulnerability meant codebooks were seldom updated and frequently mishandled. This gave American cryptanalysts the opportunity they needed to crack the system just before the pivotal Battle of Midway. Midway is remembered as a triumph of American intelligence, which accurately uncovered when and where the Japanese Navy intended to strike. The result was a devastating loss for Japan, rooted largely in its own failure to safeguard communications. Even the Navy's operational log acknowledged this, stating that the enemy had grasped our intentions beforehand. Despite efforts by high-ranking officers to disguise the true extent of the disaster, they also used the defeat as an excuse to blame almost everything except their compromised codes. As a result, the Navy made no meaningful changes to its practices. The Army knew the Navy's codes were vulnerable, but the deep inter-service rivalry ensured this information was not shared until 1943. The Army and Navy never established any kind of joint intelligence structure, and senior officers frequently sabotaged attempts to create one. This left both branches duplicating each other's work, wasting resources as they pursued the same intelligence targets independently. Cooperation was not helped by the fact that the Foreign Ministry, which also collected its own intelligence, almost never shared any of its findings with the military. Much of this dysfunction stemmed from how intelligence work was perceived within Japan's armed forces. Intelligence units were regarded as inferior, and personnel assigned to them were often dismissed as mere errand boys.
Intelligence posts were usually temporary assignments or punishment postings, leaving departments understaffed or staffed by individuals poorly suited for the work. As a result, military leaders frequently ignored intelligence reports altogether or selectively pulled details that aligned with their own preconceived plans. Rarely did Japan's military consider intelligence in any capacity beyond immediate tactical necessities, though there were a few notable exceptions. In 1940, Japan had access to the diplomatic communications of France, Britain, China, and the United States. After the fall of Paris, Japan turned its eyes toward French Indochina, a crucial supply route through which aid flowed to China. Deciphered diplomatic traffic revealed that no major power was either willing or able to defend the colony. Before local French authorities could organize any resistance or China could reinforce the region, Japan simply moved in. The operation was a sweeping success. Japan essentially walked into Indochina with minimal opposition. In fact, there should have been no resistance at all. The day before the invasion, Vichy France had signed an agreement permitting Japan to take control of the territory's military infrastructure. But because the army had not been informed, fighting broke out regardless. A major reason for this confusion was the army's continued fixation on the Soviet Union. Only after the disaster at Guadalcanal in 1943 did Japan shift its intelligence priorities. At the beginning of that campaign, Japanese intelligence had grossly underestimated American strength, believing only about 1,000 U.S. troops were on the island, when in reality there were roughly 20,000. This error was partly caused by the Army's reluctance to forward field reports to intelligence units, creating a feedback loop in which both intelligence and operational commands relied on flawed information. Belatedly, the Army changed course and began recruiting specialists in American and British intelligence. Meanwhile, the Navy's intelligence experts were collaborating with Germany to achieve a major breakthrough: cracking BAMS, the Broadcast to Allied Merchant Shipping System. After the German raider Atlantis captured a BAMS codebook and shared it with Japan, the Navy could reliably decipher merchant ship traffic. Because Allied merchant activity sharply increased in specific regions about a month before major operations, Japan could often predict where the next Allied offensive would occur. This achievement, however, was overshadowed by a catastrophic failure. American intelligence had been intercepting and reading internal Navy telegrams, in one of which revealed the precise schedule and travel plans of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's most important naval commander. Using this information, American fighters ambushed his plane and killed him. Yamamoto's death dealt a severe blow to Japanese morale and military leadership, all because of an intelligence lapse. The Navy conducted an investigation, but ultimately dismissed the event as mere misfortune. Only after his death did the Army and Navy begin holding regular meetings to exchange intelligence. In 1943, the military and the Foreign Ministry created the Cipher Security Committee to improve communication security. This cooperation lasted only about a year. By October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement of the war, the two branches reverted to a policy of refusing to share information with each other.
The Army and Navy abruptly stopped exchanging information, which left both branches operating with an incomplete and misleading understanding of events. The problems began about a week before the Battle of Leyte Gulf, during a major air engagement over Taiwan. American carrier groups launched a large strike campaign to neutralize Japanese military assets on the island and ease pressure ahead of the upcoming liberation of the Philippines. The operation succeeded. Most Japanese airfields and aircraft on Taiwan were destroyed. A few American cruisers escorting the carriers sustained damage, but not a single U.S. ship was sunk. Yet this was not the version of events reported by Imperial headquarters. Instead, they falsely claimed that 19 American aircraft carriers and 4 battleships had been sunk, figures that were passed along to the Navy. The Navy's Intelligence Division doubted this claim, since intercepted American messages made no mention of ship losses. However, senior naval leaders were eager for a decisive showdown with the United States, and chose to embrace the exaggerated report from Imperial headquarters. Crucially, this misleading information was not shared with the Army, which was planning its own defensive strategy for the Philippines. Believing that the Navy had effectively wiped out the American fleet, the Army abandoned its plan for a layered, in-depth defense on Luzon and instead concentrated on defending only the beaches at Leyte. The Army assumed any U.S. landing force would be weak and easily driven back. By the time the Army understood the true scale of the American offensive, it was far too late. Reinforcement convoys sent toward Leyte were annihilated by American air units the Army had been assured no longer existed. Predictably, the two branches blamed one another. The Navy insisted the Army was supposed to tie down U.S. forces on land long enough for the Navy to destroy them. The Army countered that it was always the Navy's responsibility to prevent an American landing in the first place. Despite the ongoing dysfunction, the Army did achieve one significant intelligence breakthrough during this period. It developed a system capable of tracking the movements of American B-29 bombers. Using IBM calculating machines confiscated from Japanese insurance firms, along with a large group of mathematics students from Tokyo Imperial University, and a sophisticated punch card-based method, the Army created a predictive model that correctly identified B-29 locations roughly 80% of the time. While it is difficult to quantify the exact impact this had on U.S. losses, several B-29 shootdowns over Japan and occupied China were credited to this tracking system. The system even monitored the flights of the Enola Gay and Boxcar, the bombers that carried out the atomic attacks, although the meaning of the word nuclear in intercepted communications was not understood until days after the bombings. These examples represent major components of Japan's signals intelligence during the war, but they only cover part of the story. Another crucial dimension was human intelligence. HUMINT includes traditional espionage and spying, but also psychological operations and the gathering of information through direct human contact. Within the Japanese military, HUMINT was viewed somewhat more favorably than code-breaking, though it was still considered secondary and not a prestigious assignment. Most Japanese human intelligence work fell under the earlier mentioned special departments, although numerous operations were also run by separate special duty agencies. Just as with signals intelligence, HUMINT responsibilities were split between the Army and Navy following the same priorities. For the Army, the main target was the Soviet Union. They conducted espionage missions across Siberia and Central Asia, paying particular attention to the Trans-Siberian Railway. Agents were often sent to travel on regular civilian trains, where they documented and photographed anything related to Soviet military logistics. The Army occasionally gathered information from defecting or deserting Soviet soldiers who crossed into Manchukuo, though these individuals rarely provided detailed or reliable intelligence. Soviet internal counterintelligence was extensive, and Japan never succeeded in penetrating it on any meaningful level. Japan avoided large-scale infiltration attempts into the Soviet Union because most agents who were sent returned as Soviet double agents. Eventually, Japanese Army officers developed an unofficial rule of thumb: never trust anyone who claimed to know too much about the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Navy's HUMINT focus was the United States and Britain. In the United Kingdom, the Japanese surprisingly aimed to recruit high-profile individuals. One example was Frederick Rutland, a celebrated World War I pilot and expert in aircraft carrier operations. After spending time in Japan helping develop Japanese carriers, he was assigned to California in the 1930s to gather intelligence on the U.S. Pacific Fleet and the state's aircraft production capabilities. He may also have had brief contact with Takeo Yoshikawa, another Japanese agent operating in Hawaii. Yoshikawa arrived in Hawaii under a false identity and the cover of being a diplomat. Beginning in January 1941, He was instructed to take part in civilian tours around Oahu to scout naval facilities, efforts that directly contributed to planning the attack on Pearl Harbor.
He carefully documented every detail of U.S. Navy activity at Pearl Harbor, and the photographs, notes, and observations he gathered played a crucial role in formulating the final attack plan. Much of Yoshikawa's intelligence was sent to Japan through standard diplomatic channels, but he also received assistance from Bernhard Kuhn, a German Abwehr operative. Kuhn established a system of coded light signals at his home in Hawaii, transmitting information on American fleet movements to Japanese submarines offshore. References to Kuhn's signals appeared in Japanese documents captured shortly afterward, and he was arrested and deported as a spy once the war ended. Authorities had already been suspicious of him for some time, partly because he lacked any coherent cover story or legitimate reason for residing in Hawaii. Japanese covert activities were conducted far more cautiously in Hong Kong, where a large-scale subversive network was being prepared. It is often overlooked that December 7, 1941, involved far more than the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan launched coordinated strikes across numerous locations throughout the Pacific. Earlier that year, the Kowa Kikan, also known as the Asia Development Agency, had been established in Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Its mission had two main parts: monitoring British and American naval movements and supporting the Imperial Japanese Army when it launched operations into the region. Japanese officers cooperated with local triad groups to manufacture explosives and carry out sabotage missions against British military facilities and infrastructure in Hong Kong. They also dug a tunnel beneath the border to facilitate the Army's advance into the colony. The Kowa Kikan's most decisive achievement, however, was the seizure of Hong Kong's main water reservoirs during the battle. The sudden loss of water supplies became one of the primary factors forcing the British garrison to surrender. After Hong Kong fell, many of these operatives relocated to Chongqing, the wartime capital of the nationalist Chinese government. There they produced propaganda leaflets and forged currency with the goal of undermining political stability. Their ultimate fate after the war is uncertain, though some accounts claim they later became involved in smuggling during the American occupation of Japan. There is one more region, technically a colonial possession rather than a country, that attracted significant Japanese interest: the Dutch East Indies. Rich in natural resources, strategically located, and filled with military installations, the Indonesian archipelago was a major Japanese objective. Japan had virtually no intelligence infrastructure there until 1940, following the collapse of the Netherlands under German occupation. One of Japan's most important operational goals was the capture of the oil refinery at Palembang. This was eventually achieved through a high-risk airborne assault, which required extremely accurate intelligence. Around April 1941, Japanese agents were deployed to gather information at the site, collecting data on output, fuel reserves, and, critically, stealing aerial photographs taken by private oil companies. This intelligence greatly facilitated the success of the operation, and similar efforts aided other Japanese advances across Indonesia. Propaganda agents embedded within Indonesian nationalist groups already fighting the Dutch encouraged many to support the Japanese landings and assist in sabotaging Dutch defenses. This strategy worked in part because local Dutch authorities were deeply mistrustful of British and American intelligence services. As a result, their small, underdeveloped intelligence presence was unable to identify or stop Japanese infiltrators. Across the Pacific, Japan had an even more daring long-term objective:
To track Allied naval movements more broadly, Japanese agents operated in the Panama Canal Zone, monitoring ship traffic and studying the canal's defenses. This information was useful on its own, but it also fed into planning for an ambitious attack. Japan devised a plan to disable the Panama Canal by bombing its locks using the I-400 class submarines, massive vessels capable of launching aircraft and for 20 years the largest submarines ever built. Japanese planners developed this idea around 1942 or 1943 after learning from prisoners of war that American defenses around the canal were lax and that U.S. officials considered an attack unlikely. Naval tests showed such an operation was feasible and had a reasonable chance of succeeding under the existing security conditions. However, by the time the I-400 submarines were completed in 1945, the war was nearly over and the mission was never executed. As noted earlier, Japan often relied on prisoners of war for intelligence. Imperial Japan was infamous for its brutal interrogation methods, but, predictably, torture rarely produced reliable information. More subtle, patient techniques were far more effective. One particularly skilled interrogator at Ofuna POW camp in Kanagawa managed to assemble an extremely accurate map and timetable of American submarine patrols simply by talking casually with prisoners during meals. Like much of Japan's intelligence system, POW interrogation efforts were inconsistent and fragmented. While intelligence sometimes enabled local tactical successes, Japan repeatedly failed to grasp the broader strategic reality. Even when it achieved impressive technical breakthroughs, intelligence work was still regarded as secondary. Bureaucratic inefficiency, turf wars between branches, and the military's overall dismissal of intelligence created a disjointed and often ineffective apparatus. A capable intelligence service would not have changed the ultimate outcome of the war, but the dysfunctional one Japan actually had certainly contributed to its defeat.